Good afternoon. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Race and Reconciliation in a Diverse Democracy, part of our Democratic Spaces series here at SNF Agora. I'm Stephen Ruckman, Deputy Director of the SNF Agora Institute, which is an academic center and public forum at Johns Hopkins University that is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. I want to thank SNF Agora visiting fellow Ashley Korku for organizing today's panel, as well as our guests, David Fakunle and Arashini Naidu Silverman, for spending their lunch hour with us today. SNF Agora's Democratic Spaces is a series of discussions about how we can cultivate spaces that enable robust participation in democracy. A healthy democracy requires that all of us, no matter our identities, affiliations, beliefs, or creeds, play a role as members in civil society. This spring, we've been hosting monthly conversations exploring how we can build the spaces that invite all voices, especially those who face current barriers, into these conversations. Today's panel will look at the hyper-polarized state our country is in and how we can create a space to look honestly at our difficult past and seek to rewrite our shared narrative to better include Native Americans, enslaved people and their descendants, immigrants, and other marginalized groups. I invite the panelists to turn their cameras on at this time. Thank you. I am really pleased and delighted to introduce Ashley Korku, an SNF Agora visiting fellow and senior fellow with the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her research focuses on threats to democracy, social and political polarization, and comparative approaches toward building social cohesion and democratic renewal. As part of her fellowship with SNF Agora, Ashley is launching the Race, Memory, and Democracy Project, a network for community groups, scholars, and transitional justice practitioners to ask questions, exchange ideas, and explore alternative approaches to acknowledging racial history in our collective memory. We'll be posting a link in the chat if you'd like to learn more about that project. Today's discussion will last about 35 or 40 minutes, and then we will be taking questions from the audience. But just know that you are welcome to submit questions at any time during the program using the Q&A function, and the moderator will choose questions to pose live to the panelists. The chat function has been turned off for comments, just so panelists can use it to share relevant information with each other. So again, use the Q&A function if you have a question. And Ashley, I'll turn the conversation over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for that introduction, and to the SNF Agora Institute for convening this conversation today. We are having this conversation really just hours after a remarkable moment of justice and accountability following the guilty verdicts in the trial for the murder of George Floyd. So I find it a very poignant kind of moment to be having this discussion. And so often, these are moments that go a different way. They make the idea of racial reconciliation seem to be quite an impossible thing to imagine. But yesterday's verdicts went the right way. They provide, in some ways, one piece of a puzzle around how we can think about social transformation and transformation of social relations in this country, and that piece is accountability. But accountability is a critical piece, but really only one part of a broader journey of how we can both prevent this kind of violence from reoccurring and how we can help to repair communities after experiencing harm. So I'm really delighted to welcome our two panelists who can help us think about how we reach reform and reconciliation, how other countries have approached this journey themselves. And so we have first David Fakunle, who serves as the chair of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is the first state level body in the United States that is chronicling and bringing to justice racial terror lynchings. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of Florida and associate faculty at Johns Hopkins here at our Bloomberg School of Public Health, and is a self-described mercenary for change, seeking to elevate anyone divested from their truest self. I'd also like to welcome Arashini Naidu Silverman, who is the Senior Director for the Global Transitional Justice Initiative at the International Coalition for Sites of Conscience. Arashini has over 20 years of experience designing and implementing community outreach strategies and programs in transitional justice contexts, and we'll talk a little bit about what that term means, but she's worked all over the world in Africa and Asia and in the Middle East. She's also written extensively on issues of transitional justice, which includes reparations, truth-telling, memorialization, and reconciliation. So thank you both, Arashini and David, and welcome to the conversation. David, I'd love to start with you. And thinking about your work on lynching in Maryland, there is a direct through line through this violent history of racial lynching in the United States to the police violence that we continue to reckon with today. So I'd love if you could briefly tell us a bit about your work with the Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Maryland, how you're thinking about that work and its impacts on communities around the states, communities around the state of Maryland, but also how you in the commission are thinking about this question of reconciliation. Reconciliation with who, and is this really a goal that we can or should aspire to?
Well, first, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here to speak with you all. And you can never, this is the thing I continue to be fascinated with about life, the way things happen at certain points and at certain moments, and how appropriate is it that we get to talk about this topic of reconciliation and race after not just the verdict in the Chauvin trial, but also the killing of Ma'Khia Bryant. No more than an hour after you have this jubilation and joy and just an inkling of justice, you're reminded that there's still a lot of work to be done. I think we needed that. It's very easy to think of a moment, an opportunity which seems so limited to be the goal. That is the end, but it's merely a means to the end, and we still have a long way to go. So the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission is charged with chronicling, with researching, with connecting with the 40+ confirmed racial terror lynchings that happened in the state of Maryland between 1854 and 1933, with 1933 George Armwood being the last confirmed racial terror lynching in the state of Maryland. So we're dealing with a legacy of, in a lot of ways, state allowed violence. I won't go so far as to say it was sanctioned, but not that far away from being sanctioned, but certainly allowed and permitted violence against Black people and Black bodies. And if there's a common through line with the experience of Africans in the United States of America, it has been control over the Black body. So it's encouraging that we're not just looking at racism, but we're looking at anti-Blackness. And this is something that even I continue to learn. I was not using the term anti-Blackness, 2 years ago. So even as deep as I am into this work, there's still so much to learn, and that's great. We should always continue to learn and to grow. We've always had in mind the bigger picture with the commission, especially because we're in this unique situation where the victims are no longer with us. The perpetrators are no longer with us. Very few spectators are no longer with us. So it is different than the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of South Africa, as Arashini knows, and others around the world. We are a legacy Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and our focus is first and foremost making sure we have the story complete. And what we mean by that is not just looking at the acts that took place, but also looking at the totality of the people who were involved, victims, perpetrators, and spectators, if we are so fortunate. And secondly, looking at the long-term ramifications of that act. So again, the last confirmed lynching was in 1933. That's nearly 100 years ago. So we have, conservatively, 3 or 4 generations of people who have dealt with the ramifications of that particular lynching, and many others, even longer, even more generations that have experienced the ramifications. Let it be known and let it be clear that racial terror lynchings were a form of terrorism, domestic terrorism, that was meant to suppress Blackness in every form of fashion, certainly Black resistance, or even what we call Black excellence, the opportunity to be separate but yet equal as much as possible. So what were the ramifications of what was in many ways a successful attack against Blackness, not just in the state of Maryland, but in the United States? Many of the disparities that I know very well, being in public health, are those consequences. And those things need to be known. Those things need to be understood. That connection needs to be made. We don't want this to just be a report. We don't just want this to be a presentation, that gathers dust in Maryland State Archives. We want this to be the beginning of a longer term process of bringing healing and justice to the state of Maryland and the United States. So calling ourselves the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is kind of a misnomer. We know that that's the common term, but it's really not appropriate to what we're doing. We're bringing healing because healing is absolutely necessary. And it's not exclusive to the descendants of victims. You can't tell me that the descendants of perpetrators don't have some trauma that they have dealt with because of this. You can't tell me that the descendants of spectators don't have some trauma that they have been dealing with. It may not look the same as the descendants of victims, but it's trauma nonetheless. And trauma requires healing. So we want to bring healing to those generations that have been affected by these racial terror lynchings, and by extension, the systems of oppression that have operated concurrently within that same space, for which there are tangible and intangible ramifications that people are dealing with right as we speak.
Yeah.
So that is the goal, and that is the point. And if we can do that in a collective sense, and if we can do that in a systemic way, ultimately, then that can bring justice. So again, I love that people are saying the result of Chauvin's trial was accountability, not justice. Justice is where we want to get to. Accountability is the methodology by which we get there. Just like equity is the methodology by which we get to equality, and hopefully, maybe in my lifetime, maybe not, but I'm cool, liberation. That's the end.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
Thank you. No, thank you. That's an incredible framing for the mission, the broad mission, as well as the piece of that mission that you are taking on in Maryland with the Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So thank you. I'd love to bring in Arashini into this conversation because of your global experience, kind of looking at this field that we call transitional justice. And I'm sure it would be helpful for folks to just hear a line or two, Arashini, about what that really means. But the kind of truth telling and reform and repair work that it has been undertaken in a lot of places. And in many countries, like this idea of reconciliation can be a very explicit goal of these kinds of processes. It's seen as a kind of a way to end something, to end a period of violence, a conflict, to create a more democratic society. So I'd love for you to weigh in on your views here, Arashini, from your global experience and how you think about applying some of those lessons to the U.S. And specifically, because we have this truth-telling institution represented here through David, what is this role of truth-telling as a part of reckoning and reconciliation, and how can they really help in those processes?
Thank you, Ashley. Firstly, I'd like to recognize that I'm on Mohican land. And thanks to SNF Agora and Ashley for organizing this. And I'm so honored to share this platform with David again. So I think just to talk about reconciliation first, reconciliation is central to the debate of justice and peace. And that comes directly from, I mean, when I think about the South African experience, which has been over-critiqued, over-exemplified, I think we find that that reconciliation was a means to achieve this peace without actually bringing justice for victims. I think one of the things that we found is that reconciliation is essentially a problematic term coming from the South African Truth Commission's Truth Commission process, mainly because it's undefined and it also sidesteps issues of justice, everything that David was talking about previously. We found over and over again in the South African truth-telling process through the Truth Commission that Black South Africans were made to come forward to testify and kind of forced in lots of ways to forgive white South Africans who came forward to share awful details with often very little remorse for amnesty. So one of the issues related to peace is that, I mean, as I'm sure lots of the listeners that know, is that South Africa had a negotiated peace settlement, and part of the peace settlement was that we would give perpetrators amnesty in exchange for truth. And the counterbalance to that was reparations for survivors. However, as we all know, there's no amount of reparations that would meet the proportionality of having your loved one killed. So in lots of what happened during the Truth Commission is that you had these high-ranking perpetrators come forward, share horrific details of atrocities that were committed, and survivors and their families had to just accept this as the truth and kind of move forward. And often in some cases, and we've seen this also in cases in countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia, where survivors are asked, so do you forgive them? And as we all know, forgiveness is a long process, but also I think I want to raise the problematic that forgiveness is so intrinsically linked to questions of reconciliation. So when we talk about reconciliation, I think the one good thing that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission did was it defined reconciliation at multiple levels. So first of all, reconciliation is a goal as well as a process, but moving it from the individual to the collective, to the community, and then to the nation. So the first type of reconciliation was individual level reconciliation, where you reconcile with yourself, what you've heard. So, I mean, I keep on thinking about the witnesses that testified at the Chauvin trial. How did they reconcile with what they saw? How did they reconcile with what happened? The sense of impotence, not being able to do anything while you see a fellow human being killed. So that kind of reconciliation. And then reconciliation at an interpersonal level that takes place between victims and perpetrators, a community level reconciliation, and then a national level reconciliation. While formal state-initiated truth-telling mechanisms can provide a platform for reconciliation, I think they're so limited in the amount of people that they reach out to, in the scope, that it's almost impossible to really begin a true process of reconciliation. But that said, it's also very necessary in creating a very inclusive and national narrative. The one thing I think that David talked about is looking at the totality of people involved. And that's what lots of the truth commissions are able to do. They're able to hold bystanders accountable, counter any kind of denialism, and produce a body of truth through testimony and documentation that can't be denied. And I think we saw that a lot in even the Chauvin trial. That was an exercise in truth-telling. There's evidence that's on display that cannot be denied.
Yeah.
So as you said, one of the questions for me is, I think reconciliation for who and who initiates it. When we've worked in countries like Sri Lanka, we've talked to Tamil youth, for example, who are the youth that are oppressed by the Sinhalese majority. And they often lash back with lots of anger saying, why are you talking to us? Why are you talking to us about reconciliation? We're not the people that are perpetrating these atrocities. We've been reaching out our hands and we want to reconcile. We want to rebuild a peaceful nation. It's not us that you need to be talking to. And again, when you bring it through the US context, I mean, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Brianna, Adam Toledo, what does reconciliation look like for their families? Is it even possible? And as I said, the witnesses, and I think the past 4 years with the past administration has made truth-telling particularly difficult with the spread of fake news, the blatant lies that were spread. So I think any truth-telling exercise in the US is going to be quite difficult. But why truth-telling and why it's important? From our work globally, everybody we've spoken to, all the victims that we've spoken to have said that they want somebody to hear their story. They want somebody to bear witness to what they experienced. I've been in situations where I've had survivors show me wounds that I was not ready to see, just so that somebody is able to see what they've experienced. And in South Africa, we talk about the concept of Ubuntu. I am because you are. And I think part of it is that when somebody is able to recognize your pain, it makes it real and in some way helps you embody it in a better way. So that's the one thing. I think it also helps break lots of the silences. So we've seen in countries like Rwanda where there's family members who have killed each other, or there's somebody who's a neighbor's raped somebody else's daughter, and yet these people still live together, but nobody has talked about it. So it breaks these silences. Currently, there are numerous local and state-led initiatives. I think you connected to quite a few of them. But I think what's most important is that it shouldn't be imposed. It needs to be, any truth-telling process needs to be locally owned, locally driven. And that, I think I'll end with also a question about what is local, because local isn't homogeneous as well. So when we think of needs, we have to think about different groups and what those individual needs would be to reach some kind of goal towards rebuilding.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Arashini, especially the applications of thinking about things you've learned from your international work and how they play out here, which is quite different. And one of the things that you mentioned was this issue around narrative and around the importance of kind of a sort of an understanding of the role that this history of violence plays in, and recovery from that plays in narratives, and the fact that truth commissions or truth-telling processes can elevate things, stories, experiences that haven't been brought into the light in the past. These are stories that are not pleasant. In most cases, they're violent. They expose discrimination, things that are deeply uncomfortable and painful. And some people, will say, because it's uncomfortable, we can't go back. And I think this certainly applies to what David was mentioning with regard to the work on lynching. The perpetrators are gone, spectators are gone, the victims are mostly, are gone. So people will say we can't rewrite what happened. We can't linger in this space of discomfort and pain. We need to move on. And I think the U.S. is certainly a case where that is, that's an argument that you often hear. And so I'm curious, how, David, from your perspective first, how do you make this link from this sort of lynchings and the truth about the past to the needs of the present? Things that, how do you make it something that people here in 2021 care about? And I think, specifically, as if we're thinking about reconciliation, we're thinking about sort of the audiences that may be skeptical to this kind of work, not the ones who kind of are bought in and believe it, but the ones for whom this does seem kind of a bridge too far and seems to be, raking up things that have been buried long ago.
Unfortunately, it has gotten much easier for us to make that connection. Less than a year ago, much of this country saw a lynching play out over what we thought was a little under 9 minutes, but turns out over 9 minutes. And I'm glad that, at least the outlets that I frequent when it comes to media, I have on more than one occasion had that described as a lynching. And I was afraid if one of us from the commission wasn't able to get on media, it would never come up. But fortunately, people got that connection, that what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd was a lynching. And the same blasé attitude and face that you saw in many lynchings in the early 20th century and late 19th century was the same face that you saw on Derek Chauvin during the lynching, after the lynching, and even when he was convicted of the lynching. So the connection has been made crystal clear for, I think, many people, which is why you saw the uprising that you saw in 2020. I have to give my mother props. She said it was the stillness of COVID-19 that allowed a lot of people to internalize the obvious injustice that is police violence for the first time. And I have no reservations or no issue with people who are upset, frustrated, saying it took too damn long. I get it. I tend to be the optimist and say, I'm just glad we're here. And again, with the shooting deaths yesterday, it was a reminder that we have so far to go.
Yeah.
So making that connection is just, again, to show all the ramifications of the act. Lynching was just the most visceral, the most carnal manifestation of racial terror and racial oppression. I would say being denied quality education is just as terrorizing. Being denied quality space, quality nutritious food, being targeted by law enforcement, getting into the new slavery, the new Jim Crow, which is mass incarceration, the proliferation of illicit substances, the fact that the substances are even illicit. The list goes on and on and on and on. And as a public health person, I'm seeing all these different clouds, all these different paths that all intersect. And it's confusing as hell, but it's true. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the mechanisms behind a lot of it, and what first opened my eyes was, again, the racialization of drugs. I came up in drug epidemiology at Hopkins, and Carl Hart, which some of you may have heard about, he came in and I talked to him, person to person, man to man. And the way he was able to explain the process by which my own perceptions about drugs were generated, it blew my mind. Just it seems crazy to think that there's almost this just like mafia or regime of people who are just coming up with all this devious stuff to oppress people, but it's true. It does happen, and it happened with drugs. With marijuana, it was done to demonize Latinos. With cocaine, it was done to demonize Black men. With opioids, it was done to demonize Asians. This stuff is all true. So there are ramifications that are far-seeding, that are just as generational, that are even more damaging than a racial terror lynching, to believe it or not. Mm-hmm. And those are the connections that we have to make. Mm-hmm. People cannot think this ever went away. It didn't go away. It evolved. It evolved. And what gives me hope, as skeptical and as cynical as defeatist as we can be, and understandably so, this is trauma. It hurts. And you have to deal with it all the time. You don't get to take it off. This is not a blue lives. This is a Black life. I was born with it. I'm going to die with it. So this is the trauma that we deal with every day. But my optimism which is a coping mechanism. I admit it. My optimism is to show that more people are hip to the game now and explicit about being hip to the game than I've ever seen in my lifetime. And some of those people who are hip to the game are now in positions of power. And that's what's making a difference. So for me, I want people to see the total story. As a storyteller, that's important to me. See the full story. See how all these things that seem jumbled and kind of just all over the place are actually interconnected. And see how all these things adding up can have a multiplicative effect on the devastation of Black communities, Latinx communities, Asian communities, Native American communities. And we have such a plethora of evidence, but yet we've been conditioned not to see it. Yeah. So much of what we're doing is opening people's eyes.
Yeah. That's super helpful. And I think, again, this idea of seeing the whole story and being sort of being aware, not just aware of it, but just, embracing like, this is who we are. And so now what do we do about it now that we're acknowledging that? Arashini, I know you write a lot about this, kind of this issue around collective memory and memorialization and the ways in which sites of memory, right, the sort of physical manifestations of how we remember, can play important roles in healing and reconciliation and in education and dialogue, et cetera. And so I'm wondering if you can share with us, some of the lessons that you've learned about the role that these physical sites of memory play in the way that we can approach reconciliation.
Okay. I think, as David was saying, racism is violence, and there's been such a trajectory of this violence in the US and in so many parts of the world that we need multiple tools to deal with it and address it. And I think memorialization and sites of memory are just one of those many tools that we can address the issue. I think what's fascinating to me is, David was saying now that finally people recognize that we saw a lynching a little over a year ago, right? But I've been in workshops, I've been in spaces where you try to talk to people and say, this is just a continuation of the violence that we've experienced since the beginning of slavery, and people refuse to make the connection. It's just this deep denial and refusal to make it. And I think sites of memory offer the opportunity to make that connection. If I think about some of our sites of conscience, they use the history of the past to very deliberately talk about some of the current social issues. So it's very hard to deny that these legacies still continue. And I think part of it is that deep, deep structural racism that exists. And then when we talk about memorialization itself in the US and in many other countries that we've worked in, where there's an oppressive environment, memorialization is part of the structural inequalities, right? So it represents the in-group, it represents the group that belongs within the national boundaries. And then there's this outgroup, and we've seen this a lot with the Confederate monuments. We've experienced that in South Africa. I was talking to somebody last week who's doing an examination of grave sites of people who were institutionalized, Black people who were buried at these sites, and they called neglected sites, but he was making the point that they neglected by who. And yet you look at Confederate grave sites and they very well manicured lawns, all of that stuff, right? So it's the question of whose narratives and whose memory is being perpetuated in these spaces. I think memorialization offers an opportunity to recognize ordinary people, ordinary lives, and also stories of celebrate the resistance. I think we forget about that often. We tend to, and that's what I was looking, as I was thinking about this, I was looking at some of the spontaneous memorials that came up for George Floyd very soon after his killing. So there was the lots of the floral tributes, but there was also graffiti, and then there were spaces where these kids were skateboarding, and so it was remembering him, but also remembering the life around him and the community around him. And while people often think of memorialization as a soft issue, it points to questions of culpability, of blame, and of justice. And we've seen this in, again, I'll use Sri Lanka as another example, where it's been families, Tamil families are prevented from mourning. They're being harassed. It's highly surveilled by police because it's such a powerful moment of collective grieving, awareness, and calling for justice. And I think we've seen that again here in lots of the different spontaneous memorials that have come up, particularly around the killing of Black men.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I think some of many of those memorials were so helpful in terms of humanizing the victim, not just of George Floyd, but of other victims of police violence. But I think they're also just they represent kind of the story that we tell about ourselves and how we see as you said, the inclusion of everybody, the inclusion of the in-group versus the out-group, and the ways that that narrative those memorials can help represent, be more or less representative of the population. Just really quickly before we transition to the Q&A, a lot of the conversation on racial justice, obviously, even in this conversation, has focused on the experience of African Americans, and sometimes, to the exclusion of other groups that have experienced serious harm, with whom there's reconciliation. That's greatly necessary, of course, Native Americans, but even more recently with crimes against and violence against Americans of East Asian background. And so I'm just wondering if either of you have thoughts about how we can think about our framing here that can make better make space for reconciliation and justice that needs to happen across multiple groups in multiple places. Who wants to go? Arashini, you're nodding. Can I start with you?
Okay. I think that's why I said I think it needs to happen on multiple levels. And when we think about local and community, we need to identify all those communities and all those locales that need to be represented. And overall, with truth telling, with memorialization, I think the biggest issue, and this is not just in the US, I think it's globally, we need to decenter the white and an imperialist narrative. So look at more broadly at BIPOC, and also through that, because part of the racial experience, experience of racism and colonialism has been divide and rule, right? So part of looking through a transitional justice lens, if we're looking at multiple groups, part of it, I think, helps to build towards solidarity with each other rather than divide. So yeah, I would say identify different groups and their different needs at a specific point.
David, quick thought on that?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I like that we're bringing up the importance of not just having the groups that have been oppressed, but having the oppressor there too. I wrote something down a couple weeks ago. It just popped up in my head. I think I was in the shower, which is where like most of my genius comes from. and it's along the lines of really making it abundantly clear, because that whole idea of that this is our issue, that's a lie. This is not our issue. We are the victims of the larger issue. And I'm so fascinated by this, and I don't know where to start. So everyone out there, I'm just telling you, this is the first time I've said this out loud to anybody else. I don't want anybody to take offense. I don't think it's offensive. I think it's just very clear. So here's what I wrote. It's very quick. Whiteness is the recessive gene / allele of humanity. And it took every underhanded tactic imaginable for it to appear dominant. Like, does that make sense? Like, first and foremost, like, I'm dead serious. Like, I want people, like, does that make sense? And it's this idea that it feels like almost every non-white group has a white person story or a white culture story. And it's this idea of dominance being based on perceived inferiority of literally everybody else in the world. And that really, in my eyes, being the dominant, I don't want to say personality characteristic of white culture is perceived superior. And it doesn't apply to every person, don't get me wrong, but it's clearly a perpetual and just again, it seems recessive because it goes against, I think, the philosophy of so many other people around the world. I don't know how many other people around the world are so focused on dominance, being better than somebody else. I know there's a natural inclination towards that, but so how has it been perpetuated, and how inherent is that within white culture? That needs to be explored, because at least the way that it's manifesting has devastated so much of the world.
Yeah.
We can't ignore that.
Yeah.
So to me, part of the healing is to be abundantly clear of how their story intersects with ours, and how their story has affected our story.
Right.
And to show that on both sides, certainly to different magnitudes, it's been devastating for everyone. Racism affects white people too. We know this. To me, it's what is the commonality, not just amongst our humanity, but amongst our struggle, and how has it affected us? That needs to be abundantly clear.
Yeah. So let's transition. We got several questions from the audience, and I know we want to get their voices here, and a lot of interest in the kind of thinking about this in the context of the verdicts yesterday. But I want to bring in this question about how you might respond to preventing sort of backlash. This idea that in advocating for a vision, a more holistic and complete and honest vision of the truth through a truth-telling process, whether that be the trial, whether that be in a commission or some other mechanism, that we might have a kind of, rather than that process, advancing reconciliation, but stimulating a backlash, and what suggestions do we have about grappling with that? Arashini, have you had any experience with in a transitional context with the majority group, or with the sort of outgoing group, resisting that transition and that transformation, and how do those countries manage that kind of backlash?
I think in most transitional justice transitional context, there'll always be the spoilers, and there'll always be the deniers. And I think what David was saying is important, like how to bring white people into the conversation, right? And I think that part of it is a moral question. Do you make space for those those that deny it, and those that are the spoilers and the naysayers, in favor of not letting people who have been oppressed and whose voices have been silenced for generations, not giving them that space? So for me, I think that's an important question. But I also think that, as I said, there'll always be people who would what's the word? Would not want to be part of a process, and would continually deny it, even if those truths and those facts are shared in a very real way. But I also think that, in the US, I also think that there, as David was saying, there's a majority of white Americans that are ready to see some peace and are ready to see some justice. And I think those are also the people that we need to be talking to and integrate into this process.
Great. For both of you, how do you see your work as similar to reparative justice? I think there's a little bit of sort of terminology here that people are worrying about, are wondering about, and one of them is what really we mean by something like reparative justice, and how does that relate to some of the concepts that we're talking about here?
That's so tough. You know, we've already been struggling with being called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because that whole notion of reconciling means getting back to something that once was. I don't want to get back to once was. Quite simply, the relationship has been flawed from the beginning. So reconciliation really is not a goal. The goal, first and foremost, is healing, as I mentioned before, and to really acknowledge the injustice so that we can work towards justice, and recognize, particularly in the case of the Maryland Lynch and Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that justice is not just acknowledgement of the crimes against humanity. Justice is not just memorialization of the fact that these crimes against humanity happen. Real justice is looking at all the systems, the oppressive systems that the crime against humanity supported, and undoing that. That's real justice. So I think for my fellow commissioners and me, it's abundantly clear that the real legacy of this work is how we would have bridged the connection between these crimes of the past and the crimes that are happening right now, and made it explicit that we were doing that. So there's no subtlety to what we're doing. We're making it clear that, yes, we are charged with looking at the past, but we are going to take that step to show the connection to the present, to alter the future, because that's the real justice that's needed.
Arashini, I was wondering if you could think about this question. You mentioned reparations, and I think folks often think about economic reparations as the kind of is what we think about. And there are communities, including in Evanston, for example, in the US right now, that are pursuing economic reparation schemes that looking at housing subsidies, and et cetera, for example. But I'm wondering if you have other example of kind of sort of reparations approaches that you've seen that would get to this question about other reparative justice kind of options.
I think firstly, Ashley, again, as David said, I think the whole idea of reparative justice also is about repairing something, right? And there's no way to repair a relationship here when there wasn't a relationship in the first place. That's the one thing. And then the second thing, I think I mentioned it briefly earlier, is the question of proportionality. If my father was lynched, nothing that you would ever do or give me would make up for his loss, whether it's money, whether it's a memorial. I think that's what we have to put on the table first and foremost. And then I think there's various forms of reparations. In the US, it's always taken to mean compensation. But in lots of different contexts, it's compensation, it's things like community reparations. So rebuilding the communities, the former disadvantaged communities, for example, bursaries, improved access to social services, healthcare, welfare, education, that kind of thing. It's memorialization and symbolic reparations. But again, often memorialization and symbolic reparations are used to sidestep questions of justice and actual reparations. But I think I'll talk about the South African Truth Commission. I think they put together a really good package, a holistic package of an inclusive form of reparations. And I remember talking to one of the Truth Commissions and commissioners, and she said to me, they were trying to be very careful about not making it a road accident fund, and to look at each individual's person's needs and each community's needs in multiple ways. So even something like psychosocial support services for people that have experienced as we're talking about all the witnesses in lots of these cases and what they've seen. I mean, one of the things I heard over and over yesterday from friends, I saw it on social media, people were saying it's such a relief. And it's just, everybody's holding their breath. Black people, people of color, indigenous people are all holding their breath for what's next to happen. And that's the kind of trauma that people are living with on a day-to-day basis. And how do we address that? That's kind of a reparative measure that we could look at. So I think we need, and I'm not saying this also again, saying that these should be done in the absence of compensation, because I think compensation needs to happen. But I think there's also other creative options to address the reparations issue.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And I think a related question, a couple of questions that have come in related to this is to David's point about the goal of your work in Maryland to be really about healing. And so there's a couple questions here I'll read. One is, how do you create paths for healing that do allow for all those involved, both the victims, perpetrators, bystanders, to process their trauma? And another question about just, how do you even sort of define what healing means for those communities?
We're not going to define what healing is for those communities. The communities are going to define what's healing for those communities. So that makes our job a lot easier, because if it were up to us, we probably screw it up. Let's just be honest. We have to be mindful of context. That's why storytelling is so important. In storytelling, you get the context, the perspective of people, and it can be as minute as an individual. This is the challenge with public health. We focus on populations. We need to focus on individuals, but it's just not possible. But in this case, we can be attuned to the various communities that are going to be represented in this commission. The focus, yes, we want everyone to be healed, but let's be clear. Our immediate focus is on the descendants of the victims, because they've dealt with the most pain. Let's just be clear. So if we have to create a space, and a cultural space, an artistic space, and we say those things intentionally, because I have decades of experience, which makes me feel old, but I have decades of experience, which shows that the utilization of arts and culture just has such an inherent power, and I use power intentionally, inherent power to encourage, empower, support, and really solicit context. That's why art is such a prevalent medium throughout human history. Even back to cavemen, they use art to convey perspective. So that is something that we will intentionally look at, and having people representative of the community who are helping in the healing process. So that's another intentional thing that we're doing, is finding people who are able to train and guide members of the community to be the healers, to have that context necessary to aid in the process, because we have finite time to do our work. This healing will go on long after the commission is done. So it behooves us, if we want to be successful and as legendary as we want to be, it behooves us to empower the communities that we will be interacting with the ability to continue on the healing after we're done. And yes, our focus will be on those communities that have been most affected by racial terror lynchings, which have been Black communities. That's just fact. So we're not going to apologize about that. But yes, we will convey a spirit. We will convey an aura of the recognized and acknowledged pain that we're all dealing with. And it's not a contest about who's dealt with the most. It's about the fact that we're all dealing with pain and trauma, and that deserves healing.
Actually, I just want to add to that a little bit, is that in the US, there's a particular understanding of restorative justice, and that it needs to be focused on both the perpetrator and the victim. And I think in transitional justice, there's an emphasis on a very victim-centered approach. For all the reasons that David talked about, it's a moral question of placing the victim front and center of the process. And then at some point when, because it's a long process for that healing, for them to get any form of justice. And then at some point, the perpetrator comes into play, right? So I think that needs to be made very clear that any process in the US needs to be focused on victims, on and BIPOC communities.
We have lots more questions, but only a couple more minutes. So I'm going to get you guys like quick and spectacular insights on last question. That's a doozy, which is how do we deal with the lasting anti-Black animus in our culture and in our policies, and how do we do that, particularly when narrative doesn't necessarily easily absorb the fact that these atrocities have taken place, that in other words, we continue to deny it. So if we're continuing to deny these things, how can we really change policy? How can we really change culture? So last 45 seconds from each of you before we transition.
All right, here we go. I'm gonna try to do this in 45 seconds. I'm gonna use the analogy of me and losing weight. I know that I need to lose weight. I know that if I keep on this weight, I will have diseases that I deal with in my 50s and 60s. I don't want that. At some point, I'm gonna realize, okay, I need to stop BSing myself, stop eating cheeseburgers and fries, which I love so much, and start eating more nutritious food and get my butt in the gym. Same with this kind of work. Time. I have this conversation with elders all the time, and they have great perspective. They have seen so much in so little time. My mother was born in 1952, right before the Civil Rights Movement. Look at how much she has seen in her 68 years. 68 seems like a long time when you're 34, which I am, but it's nothing in the blip of our history. Things are happening. It just looks slow because we're in our own space, our own timeline. But change is happening, and it takes time. Evolution is slow and ugly, but evolution happens.
Thank you. Last comments, Arashini?
Yes, it's all about time. I think now is the moment. This is the key moment in the US. We've seen police brutality forever. I mean, think about as far back as Rodney King. And finally, yesterday, we all got the verdict that we wanted to hear. So something is happening. There's momentum and a movement. And I think we just need to continue building on that. And the culture change will take generations to happen, but we can start with policy change, and these little initiatives that are happening at local levels could all contribute to that kind of momentum.
I totally agree. I think there's so much. I think the exciting thing, and I take all of you, both of you, for the sort of hopeful thoughts that you've offered today. There's this tremendous opportunity. There's a tremendous awakening in the country now, and it's happening all over the place. And so it's fantastic that you both are engaged in helping to advance that. And thank you both so much for your insights today. I'll turn it back over to Stephen Ruckman to close us out.
Thank you. Thank you, Arashini, David, and Ashley, for leading this important conversation and helping us think about the whole story of our difficult history. And forgive the background noise to my guests a little bit. Thank you also for tuning in and asking thoughtful questions to our audience. We would love to see you at our next event in the Democratic Spaces series on May 21st, Bridging the Urban-Rural Divide. SNF will be partnering with Urban Rural Action for this discussion of how citizens of our two Americas can come together across geographic, political, and racial divides to find common cause and mutual respect, and begin to find solutions for our economic, health, and other problems so many of us are facing. You can find more information about all of our upcoming events at snfagora.jhu.edu or click on the link posted in the chat. You can also sign up for our bi-monthly e-newsletter by clicking the link for that in the chat. And finally, a recording of today's conversation will be available on our website. So if there were pieces of the conversation you want to go back to, we would encourage you to do that, and you can find that on our YouTube channel. Thank you again to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.